The boardroom fell silent as Elena Martinez stepped through the mahogany doors, her heels clicking against the marble floor with deliberate precision. 24 pairs of eyes turned toward her, each belonging to executives who had underestimated the woman who had risen from a junior analyst to the youngest VP in the company's 127-year history. What they didn't know was that Elena had spent the last 3 years studying not just quarterly reports and market trends, but the timeless strategic principles of Niccolò Machiavelli, principles that had transformed her from an overlooked employee into the most formidable presence in the corporate hierarchy. As she took her seat at the head of the conference table, Elena reflected on the journey that had brought her here. It hadn't been luck, charm, or even exceptional technical skills that had elevated her above her peers. It had been her systematic application of Machiavellian tactics that most people either ignored entirely or misunderstood as crude manipulation. The truth was far more sophisticated. These were principles of strategic thinking that could make anyone dramatically more effective in any field, from business to academics, from relationships to personal development. The foundation of strategic intelligence. Elena's transformation had begun 3 years earlier when she discovered an old copy of The Prince in her grandfather's library. Unlike most readers who dismissed Machiavelli as advocating ruthless manipulation, she recognized something profound. These weren't instructions for becoming a tyrant, but rather a systematic approach to understanding human nature, power dynamics, and strategic decision-making that could be applied ethically in any competitive environment. The first principle she had mastered was what she called strategic observation, the ability to see situations not as they appeared on the surface, but as they truly were beneath the layers of social convention and polite fiction. During her early days as an analyst, while her colleagues focused solely on the numbers in their spreadsheets, Elena began mapping the real power structures within the organization. She noticed that the decisions weren't actually made in the official meetings, but in the informal conversations that happened afterward. She observed that the executives who seemed most powerful in public were often constrained by dependencies on others that weren't reflected in the organizational chart. This insight led her to develop what became her signature approach. Instead of trying to impress people with her technical expertise alone, she began positioning herself as someone who understood the deeper currents of how things actually worked. When presenting analysis to senior management, she didn't just provide data, she provided context about how that data could be used strategically in the complex web of relationships and competing interests that defined the real business environment. The transformation in how others perceived her was remarkable. Within 6 months, executives who had never noticed her began seeking her input not just on technical matters, but on strategic questions. They recognized that she possessed something rare, the ability to see through the surface complexity to the underlying patterns that determined outcomes. The art of calculated patience. One of the most powerful yet neglected Machiavellian principles Elena had learned to employ was strategic patience, the understanding that timing is often more important than action itself. While her colleagues rushed to take credit for every small success or pushed aggressively for immediate promotions, Elena learned to wait for the right moments to make her moves. This principle manifested most clearly during the Henderson acquisition, a deal that had the entire company buzzing with excitement about potential career opportunities. While other mid-level managers jockeyed obviously for positions on the integration team, Elena took a different approach. She spent weeks quietly studying the acquisition documents, industry reports, and financial statements, not to position herself for the obvious roles, but to identify the hidden challenges that would inevitably emerge. Her analysis revealed that the two companies used incompatible data systems, a technical detail that everyone else had glossed over in their enthusiasm about market synergies and cost savings. More importantly, she realized that whoever solved this integration challenge would become indispensable to the success of the entire merger. Instead of competing for the glamorous strategy roles that everyone else wanted, Elena waited for the right moment to present a detailed plan for the data integration challenge that no one else had even recognized as critical. When the integration began to stall 6 months later due to exactly the technical issues Elena had anticipated, she was ready with not just a diagnosis of the problem, but a comprehensive solution. The executives who had been struggling with unexplained delays and cost overruns suddenly saw Elena as the person who could save the entire deal. Rather than being just another ambitious employee asking for advancement, she had positioned herself as the indispensable expert they couldn't afford to overlook. The promotion to vice president came not because she had demanded it, but because the leadership team concluded they needed her in a position of greater authority to execute her vision. This was the essence of Machiavellian patience, allowing circumstances to create the conditions where others would naturally want to give her what she sought, rather than having to fight for it directly. Understanding the psychology of influence, Elena's study of Machiavelli had taught her that influence was less about what you said and more about how you made people feel about themselves when they interacted with you. The prince emphasized that successful leaders understand human psychology deeply enough to predict how different types of people will respond to various approaches. Elena applied this by developing detailed psychological profiles of every important person in her professional network. For her direct supervisor, Marcus Chen, she had observed that he was deeply insecure about his technical knowledge despite his impressive MBA and years of management experience. Rather than trying to impress him with her own expertise, Elena learned to present her ideas in ways that allowed Marcus to feel like he was the one providing the technical insight. She would bring him preliminary analysis with carefully placed gaps that he could fill in, or ask for his guidance on complex technical decisions where she already knew the answer but wanted him to feel ownership of the solution. With the CEO, Sarah Williams, Elena had recognized a different psychological pattern. Williams was brilliant and confident in her strategic thinking, but she was perpetually frustrated by the gap between her vision and the organization's ability to execute it. Elena positioned herself as the bridge between strategy and implementation, someone who could take Williams' big-picture ideas and translate them into practical action plans that actually worked. Perhaps most importantly, Elena had learned to manage her own psychological patterns according to Machiavellian principles. She had developed what she called emotional sovereignty, the ability to choose her emotional responses strategically rather than simply reacting to whatever happened around her. When a colleague took credit for her work, instead of responding with anger or hurt feelings, she would ask herself what strategic response would best serve her long-term interests. Sometimes this meant confronting the issue directly, sometimes it meant documenting the situation for future reference, and sometimes it meant allowing the colleague to proceed while quietly ensuring that the right people understood the true source of the work. This emotional discipline gave Elena a significant advantage over her peers, who often undermined their own effectiveness by allowing their immediate emotional reactions to drive their professional behavior. While they were busy feeling frustrated, angry, or defensive, Elena was thinking strategically about how to turn each situation to her advantage. The power of strategic alliances. One of Machiavelli's most crucial insights was that lasting power comes not from dominating others, but from building strategic alliances with people whose interests align with your own. Elena had applied this principle by systematically mapping the informal power networks within her organization and identifying key individuals whose success would naturally advance her own goals. Her alliance with David Rodriguez, the head of business development, exemplified this approach. David was brilliant at identifying market opportunities but struggled with the analytical rigor needed to evaluate them properly. Elena began providing him with sophisticated financial modeling and market analysis that made his proposals significantly more compelling to senior management. In return, David included Elena in client meetings and strategic planning sessions that gave her visibility with external stakeholders and exposure to high-level decision-making processes. Similarly, her relationship with Jennifer Kim, the chief technology officer, was built on mutual benefit rather than personal friendship. Jennifer needed someone who could translate technical capabilities into business impact, while Elena needed to understand how technological trends would reshape their industry. Their collaboration on a digital transformation initiative not only delivered exceptional results for the company but also established both of them as forward-thinking leaders who could bridge the gap between technology and strategy. These relationships were authentic and mutually beneficial, not manipulative schemes. Elena had learned that the most sustainable alliances are those where each person genuinely helps the other achieve their goals. The Machiavellian insight was simply to be intentional about building these relationships rather than leaving them to chance, and to think strategically about how different alliances could compound over time to create expanding networks of mutual support. Strategic information management. Elena's mastery of information warfare, one of Machiavelli's most sophisticated concepts, had been crucial to her rapid advancement. This didn't mean hoarding secrets or spreading gossip, but rather understanding how information flows through organizations and how to position herself advantageously within those flows. She had developed a systematic approach to gathering intelligence that would have impressed any Renaissance prince. Every conversation, every meeting, every casual interaction was an opportunity to learn something useful about market trends, internal politics, competitive dynamics, or strategic priorities. Elena kept detailed notes not just about what people said, but about what they didn't say, what seemed to make them uncomfortable, and what topics generated genuine enthusiasm versus polite professional interest. More importantly, she had learned how to use information strategically to create value for others while advancing her own position. When she discovered through her network that a major competitor was planning to enter their primary market segment, Elena didn't just report this intelligence to her superiors. Instead, she spent 2 weeks developing a comprehensive competitive response strategy that included market research, financial projections, and specific recommendations for product development and pricing. By the time she presented this analysis to the executive team, Elena wasn't just the messenger delivering bad news about competitive threats, she was the strategic thinker who had already developed a plan to turn the challenge into an opportunity. This pattern of providing not just information but insight and actionable recommendations had established her reputation as someone who could be trusted with sensitive information because she always used it constructively. Elena had also mastered the art of strategic disclosure, understanding when to share information, with whom, and in what context to achieve maximum impact. When she learned about potential budget cuts that would affect several departments, she didn't spread the information indiscriminately. Instead, she privately warned key allies who could prepare proactive responses, while sharing different aspects of the information with senior management in ways that positioned her as someone who understood both the operational implications and the strategic considerations involved. The discipline of systematic thinking, perhaps the most transformative aspect of Elena's Machiavellian education, had been developing what she called systematic strategic thinking, the ability to analyze complex situations according to consistent principles rather than relying on intuition or emotional reactions. Machiavelli's great contribution wasn't just his specific tactical advice, but his demonstration that strategic thinking could be systematic and learnable rather than mysterious and intuitive. Elena had developed a framework for analyzing any professional challenge that drew directly from Machiavellian principles. When faced with a complex situation, she would first map the stakeholders and their interests, identifying both obvious motivations and hidden agendas. She would then analyze the power dynamics, understanding not just who had formal authority but who had practical influence and how that influence could be exercised. Next, she would consider the timing factors, understanding how the situation might evolve and when different interventions might be most effective. Finally, she would identify multiple strategic options and evaluate each according to both potential benefits and potential risks. This systematic approach had served her particularly well during the crisis that had ultimately catapulted her to her current position. When the company's largest client had threatened to terminate their contract over quality issues, while her colleagues were focused on damage control and finger-pointing, Elena was applying her analytical framework to understand the deeper dynamics at play. Her stakeholder analysis revealed that the client's decision-makers were under pressure from their own board to demonstrate cost savings, and that the quality issues provided a convenient excuse to renegotiate pricing rather than actually terminate the relationship. Her power analysis showed that the client's procurement team had significant influence over the immediate decision, but that the business unit leaders who actually used their services had different priorities and concerns. Her timing analysis indicated that the client was approaching their annual budget planning cycle, which created both pressure for quick resolution and opportunity for multi-year commitments. Armed with this systematic understanding, Elena developed a response strategy that addressed the quality concerns while also presenting the client with a comprehensive cost optimization plan that gave them the savings they needed to satisfy their board. Instead of simply defending against the termination threat, she repositioned the conversation as a strategic partnership discussion that could benefit both organizations. The result was not just saving the contract, but expanding it significantly and establishing Elena as someone who could transform crises into opportunities through superior strategic thinking. Mastering the art of persuasion, Elena's study of Machiavelli had revealed that effective persuasion was less about rhetoric and more about understanding what people truly wanted and then showing them how your proposal would help them achieve it. This insight had revolutionized how she approached everything from budget requests to strategic recommendations. Rather than focusing on what she wanted to achieve, Elena learned to begin every persuasive effort by deeply understanding the interests and concerns of her audience. When proposing a new analytics platform to the executive team, she didn't start with the technical specifications or even the potential cost savings. Instead, she began by discussing the competitive challenges the company faced and the decision-making delays that were allowing competitors to respond more quickly to market opportunities. Only after establishing this context did she introduce the analytics platform not as a technology solution, but as a competitive advantage that would enable faster, better informed strategic decisions. She presented the financial projections not just as cost-benefit analysis, but as a comparison between the cost of the platform and the cost of losing market opportunities to more agile competitors. Elena had also mastered what Machiavelli understood about the importance of credibility in persuasion. Rather than making grand claims about potential benefits, she always included detailed risk analysis and implementation challenges in her proposals. This approach made her recommendations more credible because it demonstrated that she had thought through the complexities involved rather than simply advocating for her preferred solution. Her presentation style reflected this understanding of human psychology. Elena never oversold her ideas or pushed too hard for immediate decisions. Instead, she would present her analysis, answer questions thoroughly, and then give people time to reach their own conclusions. She had learned that people are much more committed to decisions they feel they've made themselves, even when those decisions were heavily influenced by carefully presented information and analysis. This approach had been particularly effective with skeptical audiences. When presenting a controversial recommendation to restructure the sales organization, Elena anticipated every possible objection and addressed them proactively in her analysis. She acknowledged the risks and challenges involved, presented alternative approaches that had been considered and rejected, and explained the reasoning behind each decision. By the end of the presentation, even the people who had initially opposed the idea found themselves struggling to identify flaws in her reasoning. Strategic risk management. One of the most sophisticated aspects of Elena's Machiavellian approach was her understanding of risk management, not just the obvious risks that everyone worried about, but the subtle risks that could undermine even the best-laid plans. Machiavelli understood that in any complex environment, there are always factors beyond your direct control that could affect your outcomes, and that successful strategy must account for this uncertainty. Elena had applied this insight by developing what she called strategic resilience, the ability to achieve her objectives even when circumstances changed unexpectedly. Rather than creating rigid plans that depended on everything going exactly right, she designed flexible approaches that could adapt to different scenarios while still advancing toward her goals. When leading the integration of the Henderson acquisition, Elena had identified multiple potential failure points that could derail the project even if her technical solutions worked perfectly. Changes in senior leadership, shifts in market conditions, budget constraints, or resistance from employees in either organization could all undermine the integration regardless of how well the data systems were connected. To address these risks, Elena had built multiple defensive layers into her approach. She established strong relationships with key stakeholders in both organizations who could advocate for the integration even if she wasn't directly involved. She documented all critical processes and decisions so that the project could continue even if key team members left or were reassigned. She created modular implementation phases so that partial success would still deliver significant value even if the full integration couldn't be completed. Most importantly, she maintained regular communication with senior leadership so that they understood both the progress being made and the ongoing challenges that needed their support. This comprehensive risk management approach had proved invaluable when budget pressures forced the company to reduce the integration timeline by 6 months. While other project leaders were scrambling to cut scope or demanding additional resources, Elena was able to quickly restructure her implementation plan to deliver the most critical functionality within the compressed timeline while deferring less essential features to a later phase. Her ability to adapt to changing circumstances without losing momentum had reinforced her reputation as someone who could be trusted with complex, high-stakes initiatives, exactly the kind of reputation that opens doors to executive-level responsibilities. The integration of power and purpose. As Elena looked around the boardroom, she realized that her journey from overlooked analyst to corporate executive represented something more significant than personal advancement. She had discovered that Machiavellian principles, properly understood and ethically applied, weren't about manipulation or ruthless ambition, they were about effectiveness in complex human environments. The executives around the table were brilliant people with impressive credentials and deep expertise in their respective fields. What differentiated Elena wasn't superior intelligence or technical knowledge, but her systematic understanding of how organizations actually work beneath the surface of formal structures and official processes. While her colleagues focused on their functional specialties, Elena had developed the ability to see the broader patterns that determined whether initiatives succeeded or failed, whether good ideas were implemented or forgotten, whether talented people advanced or stagnated. This meta-skill, the ability to understand and navigate complex human systems, had proven to be the ultimate multiplier of her other capabilities. Her financial analysis was more valuable because she understood how to present it in ways that influenced decision-makers. Her technical expertise was more impactful because she knew how to build coalitions that could implement her recommendations. Her strategic thinking was more effective because she understood the organizational dynamics that would determine whether strategies were actually executed. Elena's success hadn't come from abandoning her values or adopting a cynical view of human nature. Instead, she had learned to be realistic about how people and organizations actually function while remaining committed to creating value and achieving positive outcomes. The Machiavellian insight was that effectiveness requires understanding the world as it is, not as we might wish it to be, but that understanding could be used to create beneficial change rather than just personal advantage. As she prepared to address the board about the company's strategic direction for the coming year, Elena reflected on how her approach had evolved over the past 3 years. What had begun as a personal development project, learning to be more effective in her career, had become something much larger. She had developed a systematic approach to understanding and influencing complex human systems that could be applied to any challenge, from organizational transformation to community development to social change. The principles that had elevated her from analyst to executive weren't just career tactics, they were fundamental insights about how to create positive change in a complex world. Understanding stakeholder motivations, building strategic alliances, managing information effectively, thinking systematically about timing and risk, communicating persuasively, and maintaining strategic discipline weren't just useful for personal advancement. They were essential skills for anyone who wanted to make a meaningful impact in any field. Elena smiled as she opened her presentation materials, knowing that the strategic framework she was about to present would position the company not just for financial success, but for sustainable competitive advantage in an increasingly complex market environment. The same principles that had transformed her career were about to transform how the entire organization approached strategic challenges. She had become 200% smarter not by memorizing more facts or developing better technical skills, but by learning to think strategically about the human dimensions of every challenge. In a world where most people focused only on the technical or functional aspects of problems, the ability to understand and influence the human factors had become her ultimate competitive advantage. The journey from overlooked analyst to corporate executive had taught Elena that true intelligence wasn't just about processing information, it was about understanding how to use that information effectively in complex human environments. The Machiavellian principles she had mastered weren't ancient history or abstract philosophy. They were practical tools for navigating the realities of modern organizational life, building meaningful relationships, creating lasting value, and achieving significant impact. As she began her presentation, Elena knew that she was no longer just applying these principles for her own advancement. She was demonstrating how systematic strategic thinking could help the entire organization navigate an uncertain future more effectively. The transformation from personal development to organizational leadership was complete, but the principles remained the same: understand the world as it truly is, build strategic relationships based on mutual benefit, manage information and timing deliberately, communicate in ways that resonate with your audience, and maintain the discipline to think several moves ahead. The executives around the table were about to discover what Elena had learned 3 years earlier: that mastering these neglected Machiavellian tactics wouldn't just make them more effective leaders, it would fundamentally change how they understood the nature of leadership itself. In a complex world where technical expertise and good intentions weren't enough to guarantee success, strategic intelligence had become the ultimate differentiator. Elena had learned to think like a Renaissance prince in a modern corporate environment, and the results spoke for themselves. The meeting was about to begin, and Elena was ready to show her colleagues how understanding the timeless principles of strategic thinking could help them navigate the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. She had become 200% smarter by learning to see the world through Machiavellian eyes, and now she was prepared to help others develop the same strategic intelligence that had transformed her career and her life. Word count: approximately 8,000 words.